The coronavirus, so much spoken about its spread, the potential impact around the world, but what about the China reaction? What does it tell us about the Chinese government and its leader in particular? Sam Roggeveen, director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Program, now joins me now for more on that. Interesting to see, amidst all of this, it didn't get a lot of attention, but the Y-20 was deployed by China. It's described as the pride of China's aviation industry. Why?
Well, so an interesting thing, I think subtext of the whole coronavirus issue is the fact that this is, for good or ill, a massive demonstration of Chinese power, of Chinese state power. In many respects, you know, you've got a region here of around 60 million people that's been quarantined effectively, a huge city that's being quarantined, and massive resources being thrown at this problem, including, as you say, the pride of China's growing air force. And that is the Y-20, a new transport plane. I think we might be seeing some footage now.
Of it, yeah.
So that's the dark grey one. The interesting thing about this footage here, Tom, is that you might also see one of the older aircraft in the Chinese inventory just behind it there. That's an old Russian transport plane. Right. They could never get enough of those, so they just decided to throw huge amounts of money at building their own, and they're now just entering service. So what they're showing, actually, what they're demonstrating when they deployed this aircraft for the first time to Wuhan last Thursday, is that China is becoming a front-rank military power with the ability, through these aircraft, to project military force really anywhere in the world, long distances, very quickly.
And not relying on Russia anymore.
And not relying on Russia, although actually it's interesting here that if the Y-20 is a kind of symbol of China's rise as a military power, it also symbolises some of its shortcomings, because what you see on that plane, the four engines hanging off the wings, they're all Russian.
Right.
And
so the capability is still building there, essentially.
That's one of those big technological areas where they're still behind, is in aircraft engine technology. They are catching up, but they're still way behind. So in future, we'll see probably more than 100 of these aircraft enter service for China. And
it's important to stress, I mean, they're first and foremost military aircraft being deployed in a civilian situation, right?
Not uncommon anywhere in the world. In fact, we saw that in Australia during the bushfire situation.
But that's the significance of the capability, not that they can fight viruses, but what else brings their capability to.
Exactly. So in this case, they deployed medical personnel internally into their own country. But China, over the last few years, has taken an increasing interest, for instance, in protecting its own citizens overseas when there's been either a humanitarian crisis or a military situation, such as in Yemen, for instance, or in Libya when NATO intervened in Libya. But China hasn't really had enough means to really protect its own citizens. It can send ships abroad, for instance, to go and get those people if they're in trouble, but that takes weeks. So now they're developing.
We've seen firsthand here why planes are important with the cruise ship in Japan and Australians. Well, China's response, I think, has been enlightening as well. The initial denial that anything was happening, and now a pretty brutal crackdown on any information that's getting out here, including Wall Street journalists being deregistered, essentially, their credentials taken away, including an Australian. So it's the same old China in that regard.
Yes, you know, China in the past has gone through waves of kind of the liberalisation and rising authoritarianism under the Communist Party. We're clearly in the phase of, you know, a greater authoritarian streak under Xi Jinping. And it doesn't look like that's changing, at least if the evidence from the coronavirus is any indication. There are some, I think, in the commentariat who are thinking about this as a kind of what they call a Chernobyl moment, where in the Soviet Union, of course, in 1983, if I think I've got my history right there, where the meltdown of the Chernobyl reactor in the Ukraine really exposed how sclerotic and how corrupt the Soviet communist system had become. It doesn't look at the moment that this is a comparable moment. I mean, China may have overreacted, and yes, it's a very authoritarian response, but nevertheless, the government doesn't look hugely incompetent at the moment.
I suppose the test is still there, though, on how much this spreads, and the problem is the people in China might feel like that's comparable, because what they keep getting told is there's nothing to see here. Whistleblowers cop it, you know, they're getting locked up and left to die if you look at some of the initial doctors blowing the whistle on this. So there are elements of the comparison that might be fair, even if it doesn't flow all the way through to this sort of yes minister type aspect that Chernobyl obviously resulted in, which meant that nothing happened. Things are happening in China, but you wouldn't say it's a good process overall.
No. Look, the Chernobyl experience really, that's a metaphor for an incident which really led to to the eventual crumbling of the entire system. At the moment, it seems premature to kind of to think of the coronavirus in that way. Nevertheless, you're absolutely right. It's exposing shortcomings in the system. The indications I get from what I've seen and heard from people on the ground, from reporters on the ground, is that the anger from locals is being directed mainly at local and regional authorities rather than the central government.
But when does that go back up, and when do they start saying, well, because of this purge, people are afraid and perhaps competent people are no longer there?
Yep, it's an excellent question, and we simply don't have enough of an insight into the country and the system to really know. But
what about the umbrage of China over travel bans? I mean, look at 2009 during the H1N1 crisis, which affected obviously Central America. China placed all Mexican nationals under quarantine and cancelled all direct flights against WHO advice. It's a bit rich for them to be complaining now, isn't it? Including because, well, China wasn't upfront about the disease at the start, about the virus and what was happening with it.
And I've noticed also that in the last few days when Russia has announced a travel ban on Chinese citizens, the Chinese response was much more understanding than when the United States essentially made the same judgment and made the same announcement about stopping travel. So clearly there is a political element here that they're using this as a stick to beat their adversaries with.
Good to delve into coronavirus and what it's meaning in terms of China. Sam Roggeveen, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.